Hello and welcome back to part 3 of our unit on Reconstruction. Take a moment to recall our last lesson. We learned that Reconstruction was a time of rebuilding, both physical and metaphorical, for our country. The U.S. had just fought a war amongst itself on the issue of slavery, and the North came away victorious. But in the aftermath of any war, there is a lot of destruction that needs to be repaired. And with a civil war, the people have to come back together to rebuild relationships and policy. As you move through this lesson, your focus should be on taking notes that answer these 2 essential questions. Who were the radical Republicans, and what brought about the ultimate end of Reconstruction? At the end, there will be an opportunity to reflect and review before moving on. After the Civil War, there were some Republicans who felt as Lincoln did, and they wanted to unify the country as quickly as possible. Their focus was on forgiveness. However, many in the North had much stronger opinions on the matter. Radical Republicans were not inclined toward forgiveness. Radical Republicans in Congress felt Lincoln and Johnson's plans were too lenient and that the South should be punished. They believed that Southerners were traitors to the country. The goal of radical Republicans was achieving full equality for freedmen, and nothing less would suffice. And in order to understand how radical Republicans became so powerful early on, we have to look at President Andrew Johnson and the South. Johnson took office after Lincoln's assassination, and he was even more lenient than his predecessor. He grew up a poor farmer in Tennessee, and so when he took over Reconstruction, he wanted to support poor white farmers from the South. He didn't much care what happened with freedmen now that slavery was outlawed. In what is known as presidential Reconstruction, Johnson allowed Southern states to rejoin the Union by simply writing new constitutions which outlawed slavery as was required by the 13th Amendment, and swearing loyalty to the Union. He also redistributed Southern land that had been confiscated from white owners after the Civil War and given to freedmen. As a direct result of his leniency and his refusal to require states to adopt the 14th Amendment, Southern states began enacting black codes which were designed to control the movement and freedom of African Americans. This is where we meet the radical Republicans. Northerners, infuriated by what was happening in the South, supported the sentiments of radical Republicans in Congress. Congress refused to seat Democrats elected in Southern states during this time, giving Republicans greater control. In the time immediately after the war, Republicans held the majority in Congress. They passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which were intended to help protect African Americans in the South. President Johnson vetoed these acts, but the Republican Congress was so outraged by this that for the first time in history, they overrode his veto by passing the laws with a 2/3 majority. These acts divided the Southern states that hadn't rejoined the Union into military districts which were overseen by the U.S. Army. The Army had the power to run elections in the South and register voters in order to ensure that African American men were afforded the right to vote. The acts also required states to amend their constitutions to include universal adult male suffrage, which is the right to vote, as well as the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all who were born in the U.S. and equal protection under the law. Over time, due to President Johnson's leniency and the resentment of white Southern Democrats, Republicans slowly lost control of the South, and this came to a head in the election of 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes would become president, but not because he carried the popular vote. Hayes was a Republican, but he was not as extreme in his beliefs as his congressional counterparts. In fact, Hayes, a former Ohio governor, wanted to end radical Reconstruction. His opponent, Tilden, actually carried the popular vote, but it was vital to Republicans that they remain in control with the presidency. And that's how we got the Compromise of 1877. This compromise was reached between the 2 major political parties. Democrats agreed to cede the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for 3 major concessions. Hayes would name a Southerner to his cabinet. Congress would approve federal spending on rebuilding the South, and they would remove military from the South. Reconstruction would come to an end in 1877 as a direct result of that compromise. With federal troops removed from the remaining Southern states that were still under Reconstruction governments, Southern white Democrats would take control and no longer abide by the Reconstruction Acts. The rights that African Americans had just recently gained through Reconstruction would be lost through what became known as Jim Crow laws. Among other laws to restrict their freedoms, beginning in 1890, every Southern state wrote new constitutions to prevent African Americans from voting. These laws would skirt federal laws by creating additional requirements to vote that affected African American men at a significantly higher rate than white men. In our last unit of this lesson, we will explore the impact that both Reconstruction and its demise had on the African American population. For now, though, take a moment to reflect on today's essential question. Can you answer both parts?